Okay, hello. So yesterday, I posted a picture of the fuel cell setup of the Lancer, and there seems to be quite a bit of interest in how to set this up. So I figured I'd make a little video that can act as a guide. If you're experiencing the same problems we are, this might be a viable solution for you, and you can use this video as a reference. So quick background first, what's the problem? So this is the original fuel tank of the car. And for the last 3 years, I've been fighting a corrosion issue with this. Something in the modern fuel seems to be eating the gas tank from inside. So it's rusting out internally. And also the rubber parts are being eaten up, which you can see here where the fuel hose for the fuel filler, the part that's in contact with fuel has shrunk down and it's starting to crack here. The parts that are not exposed to fuel are soft, like rubber should be. And then the parts that are exposed to fuel are hard, like plastic. So this is also at risk of leaking. And there, the seams of the tank are also coming apart with rust. And the biggest problem for me is this develops pinhole leaks, which I've been patching. You can use different welding and brazing techniques or various epoxies to plug it up. But the problem is the bottom of the tank is now thin and it develops pinhole leaks which can form overnight, which causes the car to drop all of its fuel on the garage floor and you wake up with a puddle of gas under the car, which is a big fire hazard. So I'd rather not have the car or the house burned down. So it's time to deal with a more permanent solution for this. Now, ideally, there should be a replacement tank that you can buy. If you can, if it's available for your car, just buy that. Buy the new replacement tank, put it in, you're done with all of the problems for a while. It's not available for this car, and for most old Japanese cars, there is no replacement parts industry that makes those things. So that's not an option for us. Ideally, I would have wanted to make either an aluminum or stainless version of this tank, copy it to replace the original tank. But that costs quite a bit of time and money, which we don't have right now. So we're looking at a temporary solution that's a bit more cost effective. And actually, if you don't care for having the tank in the original configuration, this could be a more permanent and long-term solution for you. If it works. So what is it? So this is a fuel cell. Put that in quotation marks because technically it's not a real fuel cell. It doesn't have the safety bladder that you would get in a real motorsports fuel cell. So strictly speaking, this is a generic aluminum gas tank. But it's new, doesn't leak, fairly cheap and available. You can buy these online. I got this from Shopee. This is a 10-liter tank. It's available in different shapes and sizes, all the way up to 80 liters. I went with 10 because if you can see the trunk space here, the size of this just works for the configuration of my car. Didn't want to, you can get the wider 40-liter, it'll go here over the spare, but I didn't want to compromise the spare or the jack and the cargo space in general. So this works out for me. 10 liters is kind of small, but at this gets about 6 kilometers per liter if you're driving it hard, about 10 if you're cruising. So we have an effective range of 60 to 100 kilometers on a full tank of this guy, which pretty much covers the use I have for this car. So this works for me. Otherwise, they are more or less the same. I'd even suspect that they all come from the same factory in China, which is probably an OEM supplier for branded fuel cells that you can buy online. I've seen very similar product to this retailing for $400 US online. It's probably the same part, but this is the generic Chinese version. So they're all the same. So it's a fuel cell. Doesn't really have a manual, but you can figure it out yourself how it all works. So there's two fittings on the bottom and two fittings on the top. The two top fittings are your vent fittings. The bottom fittings are the built-in sump for the fuel output. If it's an injected car, you're gonna run your feed and return to the bottom. For a carbureted car, you only need one, just the fuel feed. So fuel feed goes out to your fuel pump, and fuel pump goes to the carburetor and the rest of the fuel system like it would with the original tank. So that part is essentially this in the original tank, this line, which is the fuel pickup, which in my car feeds the pump. Running an electric pump, this used to be mounted under the car here in the down up in the front over the axle. The reason that's done is electric pumps are better at pushing rather than pulling. So ideally you want it as close to the fuel pickup as possible at the same level of the tank. So it's doing most of its work in the pushing configuration. The top part is the vent. This is the most important part, I think, of all of this video, because I did a bit of research regarding these, and the number one complaint that I've seen people post about this is that they have fuel loss due to evaporation and the smell of gasoline fumes inside the car, which is usually caused by the vent system not being set up properly. Now, to understand how to do that, we have to look at the original gas tank first. So in the original fuel tank, the vents are up here in this port. So this bigger vent just vents to the fuel filler. That's just used when it's when you're filling the gas tank. And then the other vents go to this part here. So this is the gas vapor vents, which are distributed across the tank. And the way it works is the fuel tank is mounted under the car, and this vent system, the breather vent, runs all the way up to this metal loop. So this metal loop is pretty high up, and this goes from under the car, that goes up here, and it loops around. So the way that works is you want fuel vapor to go up, and hopefully it will condense in this upper loop first before going out of the car. So it'll go up here, condense in the loop, and then go back down into the tank. And at the same time, you have air, which you need to replace the fuel that's being consumed. The air goes in, and it has to go up this loop. So if there's any water or dirt with that air, it hopefully will not make it to the top of the loop before going into the tank. So it kind of separates the air and the fuel vapor in the original tank. So the ideal thing to do is to copy that, which is what I did here. So from the fitting, I have it going up to this fuel line here, which I've pushed up and looped into the C-pillar of the car. So that fuel line goes from there, it loops up in here, and then comes back down to this line here, which goes down and out the car underneath, and it vents in pretty much the same location as the original fuel tank did vent. I've been testing this for about a week. No smell of fumes and no losses in fuel due to evaporation, because it's essentially simulating the same setup as this one. So your tank, did I talk about the fittings? No. Okay, so the tank is all -10 AN fittings. So if you're not familiar with AN, that's the US Army Navy standard fitting. It's a 37-degree self-sealing flare. It's essentially universal size and specification. So you can get a variety of fittings to suit your needs for the car. Ideally, I'd love to convert all of the fittings to the car to AN, because it's just really neat to work with. But the cost of all of these fittings tends to run up. So if you're cheaping out on a generic tank like this, you probably don't want to be spending 200, 300 pesos per fitting on that. So the most cost-effective way is to convert this down to the same fuel line as the car. So most classic cars, you're running 5/16 fuel line or 8mm. And you can buy a conversion fitting that goes from -10 AN, easier to see here. So this is a -10 AN to an 8mm barb fitting that will let you use the original plumbing of the car. So from there, there's just a coupling, because it's a male-to-male AN connection. So you just have a 90-degree coupling to the conversion fitting, then it goes to 5/16. So that's pretty much it. You set up your breather properly, you connect your sump to your pump, and you should be good to go in terms of having this work. Now, the more critical thing is setting up the fuel gauge, which is another thing that I saw in the reviews for these things, is a lot of people can't seem to figure out how the fuel gauge sending unit works. So I took the liberty of sorting that out here. So when you buy these, you can buy it with or without the fuel sending unit. I actually bought the version with the fuel sending unit, which mounts here. The fuel sender is this. So this is the fuel sender that comes with the fuel cell. Although I broke this trying to modify it. But the fuel sender is essentially just two wires, positive and ground. And your fuel gauge is going to read differently based on a change in resistance across this fuel sending unit. And if I understand everything correctly, there are only really two types of fuel sending units, and they work the opposite of each other. So there's the European standard fuel sending unit, which is what comes with the fuel cell, at least what came with this one, which reads a higher resistance when it is empty and a lower resistance when it's full. And then the American standard one, which is what came with the Lancer, which is this one. So this is the fuel sender gauge from the original tank. This reads a higher resistance when empty and then lower when full. So you can actually, I did a test. You can test whatever you have with a multimeter set to read ohms. The factory gauge of the Lancer will read 136 ohms when empty and 27 ohms when full. The China fuel cell sender reads 113 when empty and 23 when full. So what happens is, you can actually just work with this if you don't care. If you connected this to the original wiring of the car, the fuel gauge will work but in reverse. So it reads full when the tank is empty and empty when the tank is full. You can reverse it, which is what I was trying to do here. I was trying to reverse how the arm moves, but it ended up breaking. So that's not really an option. The other option was to modify the original fuel sender gauge of the car to fit in this space that the fuel cell had. But at the same time, I realized that whatever is eating up the tank and the rubber parts is also eating the float of this. So I figured it might be a good opportunity to replace this with something new. Now, this little bit is specific to Mitsubishi cars. The nice thing about Mitsubishi is they love to reuse parts. So this specific sending unit part, this is the same across a bunch of cars over the years. And the easiest and most accessible one I could find was for a Pajero. So a Pajero fuel sending gauge, 1990s Pajero, is essentially the same as this, but with a longer arm, which is nice for being able to customize it. So I essentially bought a Pajero fuel sending unit, cut and modified it in that way, and mounted it here. So ignore the glop of silicone that's to seal up the hole where the socket passes through. And that gives us OEM spec fuel sending unit. Now, if you buy one of these things, there's no instruction manual or anything. So one of the first things that's going to dumbfound you is how to open it. Logically, I would have thought that this screws in and out like a thread, but it apparently doesn't. So the way this opens is you lift this up and you turn this into an indent, which releases a lock, and then it should just pull out. There, it just pulls out. So inside, we can see there, I bent the arm of the Pajero fuel sending unit to align with the bottom of the tank at its lowest flat part, so that I have a little bit of a reserve, so that my gauge is going to read empty when it's here, and there's a tiny bit of fuel left in the sump as an emergency if you were running this low. Now, one thing to take note is this tank comes with this. This is supposedly an anti-slosh foam, like they're trying to copy what's in a real motorsports fuel cell. All the reviews I've read online say that this is going to degrade and clog up your pump. So the smart thing to do is take this off, don't bother running that, and just make sure the tank is clean inside when you do that. Now, that was also one of the reasons why I preferred to get the 10-liter tank, because it's narrow like a surge tank. The problem with the bigger versions of this is there's no baffling inside. So if you have the wider tanks like the 40 or the 60 liters, you will get that fuel sloshing around, which is supposedly what this is for, in order to minimize that. But it's more of a problem if you're running an injected car, because the fuel slosh when your fuel level is low can uncover the pickup and you'll starve your pump. With the carbureted car, it's not so much of an issue because the float bowl of the carburetor acts as a buffer for that. So you're not really going to starve the engine of fuel if the fuel is sloshing a little bit. But this particular tank minimizes that. If I got one of the bigger tanks, maybe I'd look into welding baffles into it if it was possible. I don't know how easy or hard it would be to insert baffles through the hole on top, but that's one of the things to consider, especially if you're putting this on a injected car. So I think that pretty much covers the setup. I don't know if I missed anything. Make sure you don't cheap out on your fittings. I know it's kind of painful because they're quite expensive. But if you cheap out on that, cheap fittings will leak, and if you tighten them, they will break. Ask me how I know. This is the second version I did. The first version I bought cheap coupling fittings because I was trying to keep the budget low. That didn't work out well for me. The other thing is I've converted this all. So this is all EFI rated soft line, 300 PSI. Just because I think that this being spec for EFI cars is, or should be, more tolerant to ethanol. So we'll see how it fares in the long run. But overall, I've tested this for about a week. It works decently well for what it is. The fuel gauge works. It drives normally like it did with this, without any of the rust and corrosion issues. So eventually, we'll use this as a sample reference and make our own replacement tank setup for the car. But in the meantime, I think it works perfectly fine with this little setup here. You just have to fill it from here with the trunk open. Is how it's ending up working. So I think that pretty much covers it. If I missed anything, you can just ask a question and I'll reply in the comments. And that's it. Hope this helps you. Have a nice day.